The story began with a young prince storming inside the castle, declaring that his marriage with a princess was cancelled. Hearing this, Princess Anastasia and the royal staff were utterly shocked. She told the prince she didn't understand what was going on and wondered if he was high on some cheap PG meds. The prince gritted his teeth in anger, saying, as usual, her brain was too porous to understand anything. To drive his point home, the prince showed Anastasia a young girl named Amy. To make matters worse, the prince told Anastasia that Amy was the kind of woman the kingdom needed, not a filthy, worthless like her. He added that all the time she had harassed Amy, he was aware, and that was when he concluded she wasn't fit to be his wife and queen. At that moment, Anastasia had reached her limits with the prince's insults and was pissed to oblivion. She immediately took out her gloves, which left everyone in shock, and then hurled them at the prince and Amy, signifying she was challenging Amy to a duel. Meanwhile, a young boy suddenly woke in a cottage, loudly announcing that he remembered everything. Frightened, he placed his hand on his head because what he remembered was far from pleasant. The situation was really bad. This young boy's name was Alan, the protagonist of this story, and at that moment, he suddenly remembered something about his past life. In his past life, he played a dating sim game called Magical Fantasy on his smartphone. Surprisingly, he found himself reincarnated inside the game world. He was somehow reincarnated into the game as a background character, not as a hero but just some useless side character. He opened the window and stared into the city with sadness because, according to what he remembered, everyone who lived in this city, including his mother, would die. What he remembered was actually the game's storyline. According to the storyline, after Princess Anastasia challenged Amy to a duel, she ended up losing because the prince stepped in to fight in Amy's place. So, because of this defeat, Anastasia decided to leave the city, but on her way, her carriage was attacked by bandits, and she was never seen again. To make matters worse, the bandits were hired by the same arrogant prince, and this event led to a civil war. The neighboring empire, where the princess was from, declared war, and eventually, the city's royal capital was razed to the ground. This made Alan furious because he didn't understand why normal citizens would have to pay with their lives for a failed relationship between two arrogant douche. Suddenly, his mom entered his room, asking if his brain was in the right place, considering the fact that the boy was stark naked. Our boy turned, telling her it was nothing, he only had a strange dream. His mom then instructed him to cover up his mini sausage and then informed him that breakfast was served. Seeing how caring his mother was, Alan knew he couldn't just sit and watch her drift to the great beyond. Something must be done. This hardened his resolve to change the scenario of the game and save everyone in the city, not just his mother. While having breakfast, he recalled that the day before was when the whole fiasco started. The 8-year-old prince named Karl-Heinz had engaged the 8-year-old Princess Anastasia publicly. With this, he had 8 years before the annulment of the marriage, so he must stop the event from happening. After having breakfast, Alan bid goodbye to his mother and began walking down the street. On the way, he stumbled upon little Princess Anastasia's wagon, so he stood to take a good look at the beauty. At that moment, they both locked eyes, and as she drove past, our boy immediately activated simp mode and swore he had to also rescue the princess as well. Goddamn. In this game, Anastasia was the villainess who had a very bossy attitude. Even so, our simp MC felt she was the sweetest girl in the world, even though everyone else thought she was annoying and condescending. At that moment, Alan thought deeply about everything because if Anastasia were eventually condemned and driven from the country, she would fall into darkness and become the game's final boss. Just then, while lost in thought, he bumped into two massive blockades. These two ginormous melons belonged to a girl named Monica, who was delighted to see Alan. Without hesitation, she grabbed his head, pressing it even harder into her weapon of mass distraction. After that, she informed him she was out shopping for the disgusting old people at the guild, who were nothing but unrepentant gluttons, and then bid him goodbye. Sometime later that day, Alan entered the guild with his mom. Seeing them, some ugly mofos in the guild demanded to know what a child was doing there. But Alan knew this was the first step he needed to take to change the game scenario and save everyone. On the other hand, his mother was clueless about why the boy dragged her there. Our guy just stared and loudly declared that he was there to help clean the ditches. Hearing this, the rest of the guild stared at him in confusion. But at that moment, the guild leader's eyes widened in excitement, and then he mentioned that he liked industrious kids. He immediately ordered another guild member with a nose bigger than his life achievements to hand over the guild document to Alan's mother. With that, Alan's mom filled in her son's information, after which they handed the guild card to Alan, telling him he had to smear it with his blood. Alan's index finger was then pricked with a needle, and he went on to smear the guild card with his blood, solidifying himself as a member of the guild. Suddenly, Monica popped out of nowhere to play devil's advocate, hugging Alan and engaging her massive cannons once again on his body while his mother just watched helplessly. Following that, Alan headed to his first assignment as a guild member. He knew that if he had to change the fate of the town and his mother, he would have to accomplish two things. First, he would have to confirm if the game world was just like the one he played. Secondly, he would have to be the Elon Musk of this game. To save everyone, he would have to start by saving the villainess of the story, Anastasia. Then, in order to save Anastasia, he would have to overturn her condemnation. In other words, he would have to beat Prince Karl-Heinz in the duel as the proxy for Anastasia. To achieve this, he would have to enroll in the Royal Academy 7 years from now, which would cost a lot of money. But at that moment, he was broke and wretched, so he would have to work hard. Just then, an old member of the guild approached him, asking if he would like to work in the sewer. Even though the place was more disgusting than human waste, the man promised his pay would be doubled if he agreed. Hearing this, Alan's eyes lit up, so he told the man, by all means, he would work there. With that, he headed to the sewer. But our guy knew that money wasn't the only reason he had agreed to work in such a filthy place. Deep in the sewers lay the scroll of concealment that would be very useful to him 8 years from now. According to the plot of the game, Amy and her friends made their way into the sewer to escape the Imperial forces. Then, just at the end of the sewer, they found the scroll of concealment. If our guy found the scroll in the sewer, it would solve his first doubt, that the game had the same story plot as the one he played. Just then, he stumbled upon a brick wall that looked like it had just undergone construction. So Alan placed his hands on the wall, which surprisingly shattered, making him smile because he was certain of his progress. As he walked inside, holding a lantern, he found the scroll of concealment in a small compartment up a wall. So, as he moved to get the scroll, he hoped the ground was not rigged with booby traps, just like an Indiana Jones movie. However, as he tried reaching for the scroll, he realized that being a useless dwarf was a trap in itself. So he made use of the stick in his hand and finally got a hold of the scroll of concealment, which made him overjoyed. According to the game's plot, Amy placed her hands over the scroll to absorb its powers, so Alan did the same, and the scroll began to emit a bright light. After this, he tested the scroll's power by tapping his guild card twice and swiping it. Just then, the system information activated, and he noticed that everything he needed in the scroll was present and was just like the game he played. Just then, a guy with a handkerchief over his nose told him they were done for the day and were heading out. As they left the sewer, the guild leader, Rudolph, pointed out that they all smelled like pig waste, and Alan even smelled worse, so they would all need to shower before heading home. As they got close to the shower tent, they removed their clothes, and Alan decided to race them to the shower room. On entering the bathroom, they found Monica in her full glory, which nearly gave them a brain seizure. So they exited the bathroom faster than you click skip ad on YouTube. However, at that moment, Monica dragged Alan inside like a piece of clothing, forcing the poor boy to have a shower plot with her. However, he told her he wasn't interested in her religion, and then told her to go get a life. Later that evening at home, Alan decided to test the concealment skill. As he activated it, his mom entered his room. However, she noticed the boy wasn't in his room, though he was there. She just couldn't see him. So Alan touched her shoulders, and at that moment, she could see him, which made Alan conclude that if he did something extreme, the skill would automatically deactivate. While they had dinner that night, Alan gave his mom the cash he received from working that day. His mother collected it and thanked him but warned him not to overwork himself and that he only needed to focus on studying. Alan knew his mother was right because, to pass the Royal Academy entrance examination successfully, he needed to study geography and history. Now that he had acquired the concealment skill, he would need to further his plan to the next step. The next step would be to acquire the skill appraisal, which was necessary if he needed to alter the world's fate. However, the problem was getting to the location of the skill appraisal. This skill was not found in the sewer like the skill of concealment. He knew that if he had to find the skill appraisal, then he would need to risk his life to get it. The following morning, Alan commenced his mission to find the appraisal skill but was faced with horned rabbits in the wild. However, he used his concealment skill to become invisible while searching for the ruins. With no progress, he decided he had to return home before nightfall. The next day, Alan kept exploring the town using the game map, searching for the ruins. Thanks to his concealment skill, he could roam the town without being seen. So, on the third day, he noticed horned rabbits fighting, and on the fourth day, he nearly entered Nirvana because of the intense cold. Back at home, his mother was concerned for his health because, for days now, he had returned home very late. Even at the Adventurers Guild, Rudolph was also worried because his face had been looking more like Dracula lately. But then, on the fifth day, Alan finally found the ruins and was glad all his hard work had paid off. Excited, he decided it wasn't the time to dance in happiness, but the time to get to work and search for the skill appraisal. However, at that moment, he started to sweat bullets when he noticed a bunch of ugly goblins entering the ruins. This left him in shock because, as long as he could remember, there were never any goblins in this part of the game. At that moment, our boy immediately activated the concealment skill and hid from the goblins. Anxious, he wondered why the game scenario was out of order, but he knew he needed to remain calm and not mess up this opportunity. Missing this once-in-a-lifetime chance of getting the scroll, he would never get a second opportunity. With that, Alan squeezed his stick tightly, concluding he needed to harness the power of the game cheat skills. Just then, using his concealment skills, he began to walk amid the goblins undetected until he could finally enter the underground ruins. Getting inside, he noticed the place was bright because of the presence of glowing moss. Fortunately, he didn't need any torch, but all he hoped for was not to see the horrible-looking goblins inside. As he ventured deeper, he arrived at a place called the Little Room, and as he could remember, this was where the appraisal scroll was found. However, he was shocked when he could only find chests and weapons there. He knew the scroll should definitely be there, and was confused as to why everything he could remember about the game scenario was changing. Suddenly, he heard a growl behind him, which frightened him to death. It turned out to be a goblin carrying a sack of gold, so Alan immediately covered his mouth with his hand to stop himself from making any sound. Looking at the stack of gold, he wondered when the little room had become a treasure storage ground for goblins because such settings never existed in the game. Suddenly, the ugly goblin began to perceive a disgusting smell, so it leaned closer to Alan. But then, the stench emanating from the goblin nearly sent this boy to an early grave, so he covered his nose and held his breath as long as he could. Luckily, the goblin still couldn't detect his presence, so it moved away. With that, Alan was relieved to survive yet another day. However, he was still worried about why everything happening in the ruins was totally different from the game. He deduced it must be because a certain villager had obtained the concealment scroll meant for Amy, so the game had modified itself. At that moment, he stabbed the ground and found the appraisal scroll. He was able to discover the scroll because it was written on the ruins map that it was buried in the ground, which made it difficult for the goblins to find. After this, Alan left the ruins and returned to the city in one piece. He then sat on the ground, placed his hands on the appraisal skill, and obtained it. This excited him because it was a big step toward achieving his goal. The following week, Alan arrived at the guild and realized everyone was weirdly excited, so he asked Rudolph if they had won a lottery. Rudolph revealed that they had discovered a goblin nest in the ruins, and if left unattended, it would cause severe damage to the city, so they were organizing a strike team to attack. Hearing this, Alan knew he had made the best and wisest decision to have taken the appraisal scroll earlier. Alan then asked if Rudolph would be a part of the strike team that would be attacking the goblins. Rudolph responded, telling Alan he was a retired adventurer, and then showed him his prosthetic leg. He revealed that he took a poisonous arrow to his knee while working, which cost him his leg. However, he assured Alan that he wasn't totally useless, and then promised to teach Alan how to wield a sword when he was ready. But then, Alan was lost in thought, wondering why the man's face was more disgusting than public toilets. The following day, while our boy cleaned the ditch, he thought about his plan and concluded that the next course of action would be to get the alchemy scroll. So, after work that same day, he walked through the market, pondering how to get the alchemy scroll, which was an in-game item. The problem now was that this scroll could only be purchased, and it was pretty damn expensive, costing about 15 million cents. With that, our guy needed to find a way to earn enough money to buy the alchemy scroll. As he continued to walk through the market, he noticed that merchants had already set up stalls. So a genius 500 IQ idea struck him that this was the perfect opportunity to use the appraisal skill to make some cool cash. That was when he noticed something that caught his attention. Using his appraisal skill, he examined an item, the Earring of Strength, which boosted the wearer's strength and was originally valued at 300,000 cents. With that, he smiled and approached the merchant, asking to buy the earring. However, the scrawny old man revealed that there was only one earring left by the wife of a merchant in exchange for a loan. Alan smiled, telling the man it was perfect, and he would take it. The old dude reminded him that there was only one earring, and no sane girl would accept it as a gift. Even so, Alan handed him his guild card, telling him he would purchase it. With that, Alan bought the ring for 2,000 cents and then walked away, leaving the nosy old man still shouting that the gift was totally worthless to woo any girl. After breakfast the next morning, Alan picked up his bag, telling his mom he was heading out. His mother asked where he was off to, and he told her he was going to the market. The woman couldn't help but notice how grown Alan had become. So, she told him not to return before it got dark because the next day was a big day. As Alan walked down the street, he pondered how, for 2 years, he had been training and working hard to achieve his goal of saving 15 million cents in his guild savings account. Now, the time had come for him to get the alchemy scroll, but he would have to pass through dangerous alleys to get to the store. To do that, he immediately activated his concealment skill so he could move without encountering any trouble whatsoever. Finally, he arrived at the store, deactivated his concealment, and knocked. Entering this store required saying a secret password. So, Alan activated his alchemy skill, and placing his hands on the door, the password appeared. With that, he uttered the secret password and entered the store. On entering, the old, creepy store owner in a hoodie welcomed him, and then asked what he was looking for. Alan responded, telling the old freak he was there to purchase the alchemy scroll. The old merchant replied, telling him it was a very nice choice, but it would cost 14 million cents. Our guy told him, "No diggity, I'm loaded." So the old man turned, pretending to search for the scroll. A few seconds later, the weirdo showed Alan a scroll, declaring it the alchemy scroll. However, our boy wasn't someone to scam so easily. So, at that moment, Alan immediately activated his appraisal skill and noticed that the scummy old man had given him an ordinary, worthless scroll. With that, Alan asked the old ugly if he thought he was stupid or something. The old man stared with one eye like a true criminal, telling Alan that he had passed the test. He then brought out the real alchemy scroll from his cloak and gave it to Alan. Using the appraisal skill, Alan could tell it was the real deal. So, our boy paid with his guild card and then placed his hands on the scroll, emitting a bright light as he absorbed the skill. Later that evening, when he got home, his mom was furious that he was late. She yelled at him to get his ass in bed immediately because tomorrow was going to be an important day. While sitting in bed, Alan glanced at a book, thinking about his graduation exam in school the next day. Alan was able to write the graduation exam, even though he was just 11 years old and wasn't up to the eligible age of 12. The next morning at school, the hot teacher approached him, informing Alan that the graduation exam would commence soon. The teacher then smiled, telling him that graduating at 11 was unheard of, which was highly remarkable, and then wished him success in the exam. Holding an hourglass, she informed Alan that the exam would be for 3 hours and then asked him to begin. As the exam began, Alan answered the current affairs questions and solved the mathematics with ease. When it got to geography, it was pretty much the same in any world, so our boy ate and left no crumbs, with just a little over an hour left. Alan raised his hand, so the teacher assumed the tiny dumbass had a question to ask. But when Alan mentioned that he was done, she was in total shock. Still in disbelief, she insisted he go over the answers again and not be in a hurry, but Alan told her he was sure the answers were fine. After saying that, Alan stood up to leave like a true Sigma, so the teacher informed him that the exam result would be out in a week. A week later, at school, Alan heard someone shouting his name from a distance. It turned out to be the teacher, who was panting profusely. With her eyes widened in disbelief, she informed Alan that the results were out, and he had passed with a perfect score in all subjects, even though he was just 11. The teacher, still impressed, pointed out that he had broken the city's long-standing record of becoming the first kid to pass the exam. But Alan told her he was very good at breaking backs, too. With that, the teacher told Alan he deserved a perfect recommendation to enter any high school of his choice. However, she mentioned that Alan would not be able to gain entry into high school until he was old enough, which was 4 years from then. But Alan remarked that he was willing to wait. So, the teacher held his hands and congratulated him on his graduation. That instant, a bunch of clueless morons appeared from nowhere, congratulating him, but Alan just smiled. He knew their gullible asses would never know he was able to achieve all this because of his reincarnation cheats. With that, our boy graduated from middle school, so his mother decided to celebrate his graduation with a feast. With sadness in her eyes, she gave him a small dismantling knife as a gift, saying that was all she could afford since money was avoiding them. On the other hand, Alan stared at the knife in delight because he had always wanted a dismantling knife. The gift was special to him because, even though his mother didn't have a dime to her name, she somehow bought him a gift with all her heart. With that, he began to shed tears, but his mother told him she just wanted him to be happy. The mummy's boy then assured her that he would take care of the knife like a treasure, and would also save up for his school tuition. A year later, Alan was informed that he would be allowed to take the high school entrance exam as he had been exempted from the age restriction rule. He was also promoted to a rank F adventurer. To congratulate him, Monica lunged herself with her bouncy plot to give him a hug, but our top G evaded the hug with sonic speed. Seeing this, Monica was shocked that the boy could move so fast. Also, the rest of the crew congratulated Alan for the promotion, but with Alan being promoted, that meant there was no one to clean the ditch. However, Rudolph approached Alan, encouraging him to keep up the hard work and assuring him there was still room for him to grow even more. Rudolph told him he was impressed at his growth and development, considering the fact that he wasn't blessed with the divine protection of a swordsman or warrior. Divine protection was a kind of blessing from the gods of the world that boosted proficiency in a certain field or allowed a person to use a special ability. Amy, for instance, the heroine of the game, possessed the healing type of divine protection that allowed her to learn magic recovery. Meanwhile, Karl-Heinz, the Crown Prince, possessed both the fire and hero divine protections, which gave him fire magic and exceptional swordplay ability fit for the protagonist of the game's story. Also, Rudolph was blessed with the swordplay divine protection, even though, at the moment, he was just a disgraceful vegetable due to injury. Alan, on the other hand, wasn't blessed with any divine protection, as was the case for most commoners. But for Alan to excel, he must do something about his lack of divine protection. With that, Alan asked Rudolph what he had to do to become an E-rank adventurer. Hearing this, Rudolph was dumbfounded because this boy had just become an F-rank adventurer just a few days ago. However, Rudolph revealed that he would have to complete one F-rank task, and then boom, he would become an E-rank. Alan was shocked that it was just that simple. Rudolph responded, telling him he had to gather a few herbs and hunt horned rabbits, but warned that these were not easy tasks. 2 days later, Alan placed some herbs and horned magic rabbit stones on the table, leaving everyone in shock that he had completed the task so fast. The herbs were gathered in the ruins where the goblins were, and since the guild had eliminated the goblins, it was pretty easy for Alan. As for the magic stones, Alan used his concealment skills to hide himself from the horned rabbits, making it easy for him to annihilate them with ease. With that, Rudolph congratulated Alan on becoming an E-rank adventurer. At home, while Alan looked at his window status, he noticed that he had been given a blank space to acquire divine protection, which only the privileged enjoyed. In the game, only one divine protection could be acquired, which was located in the Valley of the Flying Dragon, a week-long ride from the capital. This divine protection was called the Wind Magic Talent, which could be used to strengthen wind strength magic. Back in time, a female wyvern was attacked, and her husband was assassinated. It turned out that Amy and Karl-Heinz were responsible. However, they apologized to the Lady Wyvern for eliminating her man. Despite their several apologies, the wyvern grew even angrier and attacked relentlessly. With no other choice, Amy created an offensive barrier, pulverizing the wyvern with a massive energy blast. Suddenly, the child of the wyvern delivered a sneak attack from behind them, but Karl-Heinz slashed its head off before it could cause any lethal damage. After that brutal elimination of the wyvern family, Amy began to cry regretfully, so Karl-Heinz comforted her, reminding her that there was no other way. Back in the present, Alan, sleeping inside a wagon, woke from the dream. He remembered this was the tale of the magical fantasy event that ended with Amy getting the Book of the Wind God in the game. In his opinion, Amy and Karl-Heinz were to blame for breaking into the wyvern's home and looting its items. Alan also didn't buy the pathetic display of regret by Amy and felt there was a certain emptiness in Amy's tears. Following that, he paid the driver some coins, got down from the wagon, and decided to continue the rest of the journey into the Valley of the Flying Dragon on foot. According to legends, ferocious demons lurked in the mountains, so Alan decided it would be wise to use his concealment skills while going through the mountains. Halfway up the mountain, the sore weakling became exhausted, feeling like he would die from tiredness. Suddenly, he noticed a mighty wyvern hovering above him. In fright, He surveyed the valley's landscape and was shocked when he noticed hundreds of wyverns in the sky. That was when it dawned on Alan that he had finally arrived at the Valley of the Flying Dragon. He then decided to set up camp before sunset, and with that, he immediately engaged his alchemy skills. At that moment, building blocks appeared from nowhere and aligned themselves perfectly on top of each other. The alchemy skill was the perfect skill for crafting. In the game, it was mainly used for crafting and strengthening weapons and armor. Several hours later, Alan was done building the perfect small semi-basement camping area, which made him very delighted. Acquiring the skill for 15 million Nera wasn't a bad investment after all. Before sleeping that night, he picked up the knife his mom had bought for him, remembering her. The next morning, our boy was all set to visit the Temple of the God Wind. He knew he had to use his concealment skill once again because, in the game, wyverns attacked whoever approached the temple and drained their strength. Shortly afterwards, he got to the stairs of the temple. He climbed, and upon arriving at the top, he was shocked to see a mighty black wyvern fast asleep. Thinking it wise not to disturb the big guy, the plan was to collect the Book of the Wind God and scram like he was never there. However, at that moment, he heard a voice behind him, and a mighty wind gust nearly swept him to nirvana. Before his eyes appeared a ripped, unclad man with chiseled abs and long hair who told him he needed a favor. Alan was shocked that the man could see him even while he was invisible and thought the best plan of action was to escape. However, the man showed him a scroll, telling him that if he ran away, he would lose what he had been looking for. Just then, Alan noticed the scroll was the Book of the Wind and wondered who the heck the naked man was to even be able to read his mind. The hot, naked guy then introduced himself as the God of Wind and informed Alan that before they discussed any further, he had to wake up the sleeping piece of shit. Harnessing the mighty power of the wind god hurled the useless reptile to the sky and slammed it to the ground with a loud thud. With the wyvern still in deep slumber, the wind god grabbed it by the tail, flew it upwards, and slammed it on the ground again. Just then, the wyvern opened its eyes and introduced itself to Alan as Jerome, the Wyvern Lord. After the introduction, the wind god delivered shocking news, telling Alan he wanted him to help find Jerome a wife. Hearing this, Alan was perplexed because he couldn't even bag himself a chick and wondered how the wind god wanted him to be a pimp. The wind god then informed Alan that Jerome had fallen in love with a wyvern chick called Melissa. If Alan could help bring their love story to reality, the wind god promised to reward him with divine protection. With no other choice, Alan began his matchmaking job by asking Jerome what Melissa looked like. Instead of talking, Jerome took Alan to another part of the mountain, showed him a giant white feminine wyvern, and mentioned that it was Melissa. At that moment, Alan noticed the ribbon around Melissa's tail and suddenly remembered that Melissa was the final boss of this mission in the game. In the game story, Jerome was at the peak of happiness building a family with Melissa before Amy and Karl-Heinz overran the place. With that said, Alan asked Jerome if he knew Melissa's hobbies or anything she liked, but he was shocked when he realized the wyvern simp hadn't even talked with Melissa ever. He was just a stranger and a creepy stalker. So, Mr. Matchmaker thought it would be best they started off being friends. With that, Jerome approached Melissa, covering his face shyly while Alan hid behind a rock, hoping the big guy would rizz up the reptile chick. However, this dude was more rizzless than most of the losers watching this video and only ended up irritating the chick, causing her to leave. Seeing their plan had failed, Captain Cupid decided it was time for the second phase, which would involve getting the girl a gift. So Alan asked Jerome what kind of gift a wyvern chick would love, so Jerome responded by telling him some good old spicy meat. With that, Alan asked the wind god to take them to where Melissa was, which he did while Jerome searched for some piece of meat. As they watched, hiding behind a rock, they noticed Jerome flying towards Melissa with a nice succulent worm in his mouth. However, this only horrified the poor girl, so she flew away before he could land. With their second plan gone to waste, Jerome commented that appearance would surely do the job. Of course, every girl loved a dude with a good fashion sense like Canais. Even though Alan had no idea about the trending designer clothing for wyverns, he assumed a good old suit and tie would never go out of taste. So, using the power of alchemy, Alan crafted the perfect necktie for Jerome, which made Jerome so excited that he almost kissed Alan. So, with everything intact, the wind god showed them where Melissa was. However, at that moment, they noticed a bunch of other black male wyverns surrounding Melissa. Without wasting any second, Jerome took off flying, followed by the wind god carrying Alan. Jerome finally got to the location where some thug wyverns were oppressing Melissa. With that, in an attempt to land, he accidentally crashed on top of Melissa in the most awkward way. Seeing Jerome, the wyverns began roaring at him and then started to beat the living daylight out of him. While taking the beating like a true simp, Jerome shouted at Melissa to take advantage of this opportunity to escape. However, as she tried to escape, she got caught by one of the wyverns and was slammed back to the ground. Seeing this, Jerome furiously activated Berserk mode and fought off the wyverns that gathered around him. After this, he began to escape towards Alan and the Wind God, but the wyverns chased after him. At that moment, Alan mentioned that the wyverns were charging towards them. So the Wind God inhaled massive air and then exhaled, whisking them away effortlessly. Following this, Melissa asked who they were, so Alan replied, telling her they were friends of Jerome and had come to save her. Suddenly, Jerome was drained of energy, so he suddenly dropped from the sky, landing on top of Melissa. She immediately asked him to get off, complaining about his weight. So, as Jerome moved to leave, she grabbed him by his tail and thanked him for saving her. She followed it up with a kiss, telling him he was cool, but bro immediately collapsed from receiving his first kiss. With that, Alan's mission was complete, even though he didn't have to do much. The Wind God then fulfilled his promise, placing his hand on Alan's head and blessing him with the power of divine protection. The Wind God also turned to Jerome and his babe, saying he would bless them with the divine blessing once they were married. But the word marriage almost caused Jerome to pass out because all the big guy wanted was just a one-night stand. With the Wind God gone, Alan stared at the altar and noticed that the scroll of the Wind God had also vanished with him. With this, even if Amy came to get the scroll 4 years later, she would only be met with disappointment. Alan couldn't wait to see how this outcome would affect the game. At that moment, the wyvern couple thanked Alan for his impressive matchmaking skills. However, Alan warned them to stay far away from the mountain for the next 4 years, saying something terrible might happen to them. Melissa also thanked Alan for upgrading her booze drip and then informed him that anytime he needed help, they would show up no matter what. With that, the couple flew into the sky, bidding Alan farewell. With Alan securing the divine protection, he sat in his basement camp and thought of his next course of action: to build high-speed transportation, and a glider was perfect for this purpose. Even though the fastest means of transportation in the world was the horse, even the horse had its limitations and could only run a few hundred kilometers. Only a glider could travel hundreds of kilometers per hour, and that was exactly what he needed. With that, Alan's resolve hardened to make a motor glider powered by wind magic. With his experience as an aeronautical engineer in his past life, he was certain making a glider would be a walk in the park. The next morning, he wheeled some materials to a deserted field. This field would be his test runway, so it had to be cleared. Alan immediately activated the wind magic in his hands and, using Wind Cutter, he slashed the grasses. Afterwards, he stared at his window status and noticed that his magic power had increased from a rank F to a rank D, which was pretty cool for a level E adventurer. He then wondered if it was because he had just received the divine protection of the Wind God. However, thanks to the creepy god, he could mow the grass and fly a glider. After clearing the land for the runway, Alan opened a scroll, revealing a magic circle. Then, using the bones, skin, and magical stones he retrieved from the dead wyverns Jerome had defeated, Alan smelted the materials. He activated his alchemy skill and transformed the items into a glider. The weather was good, and with the runway cleared, Alan decided to test his glider. He sat on the glider, placed his hand on the handle, and then activated his wind magic. At that moment, the glider began to move at full force, which made it quite difficult for Alan to adjust the output. He thought it would be best to stop, but was determined to keep thrusting forward. Finally, the glider was up in the sky, almost splitting Alan in half with excitement. Even though he hadn't flown since he was a student at the university back in his previous life, he was still a pretty good pilot. At that moment, a girl looked up to the sky and noticed the glider. It turned out to be little Anastasia, who loudly announced that she had just seen a strange bird. Her friend, Margaret, demanded to know where, and Anastasia replied, telling her it just flew past the forest. She added that even though the bird had wings, it didn't flap them, yet still flew. Hearing that, Margaret suggested it could be a wyvern that must have wandered off its territory, so it was best they reported the news to the castle. Meanwhile, Alan could see the royal capital in just a few hours, which normally took a horse several days, so he decided to prepare for landing. But the problem was, where? The streets weren't wide enough, there were no oceans or rivers nearby, and there was no parachute either. Just then, he spotted a lake. so he thought that was his only choice for landing. With that, he started to descend the glider, and on getting close to the lake, he tried to steady the glider but ended up crashing it into the water. Shortly afterwards, Alan emerged from the lake, soaked with water and lucky to be alive. The bad news: the glider was completely destroyed. Even though he had a successful flight, the glider was ruined. Regretfully, he had lost 2 precious wyvern magic stones, a femur, and wings in one flight. Sometime later, Alan returned to the capital. Seeing him, Rudolph wondered why he was soaked, thinking he probably had a meet and greet with the sharks. Alan responded, telling him he messed up and fell into the lake. Just then, Monica spotted him. Thinking Rudolph was responsible for drenching Alan with water, she scolded him for being too harsh with his training. But Rudolph denied it, telling her the little man did all this to himself. With that, Monica grabbed Alan, dragging him to shower with her. However, Rudolph intervened just in time, saying Alan was now old enough with a mature pickle and shouldn't be enjoying such exclusive shower time privileges. After showering alone, Alan sold off some items he picked up during his journey to his usual dealer. Afterwards, he arrived home to see his mother and finally retired to his bed. The following day, while on the street, he reflected on the events of his journey, and it all came down to the fact that he was a failed engineer. He never included a landing site in his plan and never made a parachute available in case of an emergency. To make matters worse, he should have turned back instead of crashing the glider into the lake. He brooded about how he wouldn't have made such a rash and foolish decision in his previous life as an adult. Guess being reincarnated into this world as a child had its perks, which included having the dense brain of a child. However, as far as making gliders, he was certain there were no errors in the basic designs. On getting home, Alan began sketching out some designs because what he wanted at that moment was a plane that could take off vertically and land without a runway. He then concluded that making a certain type of airplane called the VTOL was the only solution. For his next plan, he would need some cheat items, and he would also need the scroll of multiple chanting. The following day, Alan geared up and smelted the VTOL glider, which was an improved version of his old glider. After this, he grabbed onto the handle, and using the power of the wind, he began to accelerate and was finally in the air. In this world, to create anything using alchemy skills, certain requirements had to be met. First was the accuracy of the blueprint. This was the advantage Amy had because, as the game's protagonist, she could use magical powers. However, since our boy had no magical powers, it was essential he prepared an accurate blueprint to enable him to visualize the image structure in his mind. Secondly, he needed to prepare sufficient materials because it was nearly impossible to create something out of nothing. Before long, Alan finally arrived at the Sage Tower, a tall building with 300 floors. He then navigated the glider all the way to the top floor. Once at the top floor, he grabbed his parachute and launched himself out of the glider better than Tom Cruise would. After that, he chanted the wind spell and directed the glider to crash at the peak of the Sage Tower. While doing so, he steered his parachute to the top and immediately smelted the glider back to its storage state. With a rope in hand, he lowered himself, wrecked the wall, and infiltrated the top floor where the chest containing the Chantless Scroll was kept. He was glad because if he had not used a glider, he would have encountered everything from traps to monsters and then the final boss. However, with the use of the glider, he encountered no obstacles whatsoever. He opened the chest, found the scroll of multiple chants, and, without wasting a second, placed his hands over the scroll to acquire the skill. Suddenly, Alan noticed the broken wall of the tower had begun to repair itself, which meant he had to get the hell out of there. The story behind the scroll of multiple chants started long ago with a mage who loved helping people with his magic. This sage was able to manipulate magic spells without uttering a single chant. However, one day, on his way to the village of the elves to share an ingredient for a potion, he got lost and was never seen again. His soul transformed into the scroll of multiple chants. According to popular belief, his essence was found deep in the Forest of Illusion to be found by anyone with the desire to help people. With that, our guy set course towards the entrance of the Forest of Illusion. He thought about the elves guarding the entrance, but since he would fly above them, it should be an easy, simple recovery operation. He stared at the map he had purchased from the guild and realized there was a village very close to the entrance of the Forest of Illusion. While searching for the village, the sun began to set, which made Alan worry a little because, when it got dark, demons roamed around the village. Just as panic began to set in, he finally sighted the village. So, he descended the glider and, using the vertical engine, he controlled the altitude on both wings. With that, he landed perfectly. Immediately, he smelted the glider to hide the aircraft and began to move toward the village. Suddenly, an elf pointed a stick to his head, commanding him not to take another step or lose his head. It turned out our boy had been flanked by a group of elves armed with bows and arrows. The scene shifted to a tent where Alan was tied up like a cow. A pretty, white-haired elf asked for his name and why he was in the elven village. As Alan was about to say a word, another elf with the face of a blobfish threatened to end his life quickly with the stick if he lied. However, the elf queen told the eager dude to calm the heck down. She mentioned that it was impossible for humans to find a way to the village and demanded to know how Alan managed to get there. Alan replied, telling her he had come from the sky, which startled her. She asked if he was the one who came with the strange vehicle. But the elf, who was as scary as your mom, jumped in, telling the elf queen that he couldn't detect magic from the disgusting liar. So such a worthless child couldn't have possessed such powerful flight abilities, which the queen agreed. Right then, Alan informed them that he had the divine protection of the wind god, leaving them in shock. Hearing this, the elf queen suddenly began thanking the gods for not abandoning them, leaving Alan confused about what was happening. A few moments later, sitting with the elf queen, she begged him to save their village. She revealed they were struggling with an evil spirit from the Forest of Illusion who always came to their peaceful village to terrify them. Alan, on the other hand, was clueless because he was unfamiliar with such an event in the game. The queen added that the evil spirit would chase them. But luckily, no one had been harmed due to its extremely slow speed. However, she feared that, at this rate, she might not be able to protect her people and the village. After saying this, the queen bowed before Alan, begging him to help them. Right then, someone walked into the room, shouting, "Mother." It turned out to be the elves' princess, Sherry, who told her mother there was no need to involve the humans because she could exterminate the monster alone. However, the queen immediately yelled at her, asking her to get her ugly face out of her sight. Suddenly, another elf stormed in, informing the queen that the evil spirit had returned. Upon hearing this, the stubborn princess immediately rushed outside, while the queen continued to plead with Alan to help them. So, just then, the rest of the guards, including Alan, moved out only to see an ugly man in a black cloak emitting a bright aura approaching the village. Alan was shocked that this creepy bastard was the evil spirit they all feared. He wondered why they were afraid. Even though the man's face looked worse than broccoli, he sure wasn't an evil spirit. He was just an ugly wizard. Alan then asked the queen if the suspicious-looking man was the evil spirit she was talking about. The queen responded by asking him if the black fog was a man. Hearing this, Alan wondered if these people had been smoking because they were clearly seeing something entirely different from what he saw. On the other hand, Sherry was determined to end the evil spirit, so she prepared her bow and arrow and fired at it. However, the man deflected all her arrows effortlessly. Seeing this, the elf queen immediately shouted at Sherry to leave the fight for the soldiers because her attack was as useless as her dating life. At the same time, Alan was confused about who the heck this man was to be this strong. However, he decided to try talking with the deranged old man. Before he could even say a word, the old wizard shouted, telling Alan that he was just a middle-aged virgin, which gave Alan a total shock. The old wizard also revealed that the name given to him by his parents was Loringas. But in the heat of the moment, Alan realized that the old degenerate was chasing after a little winged girl. So, he asked the man what his mission was in the elven village. The man responded, telling Alan that all he wanted was to meet the spirit of the village. But Alan couldn't make sense of what the man was talking about. The wizard shouted that the little girl he was after was a lowly who had lived for thousands of years. Meanwhile, while this conversation was ongoing, the elves stood in absolute surprise that Alan was actually discussing with an evil spirit. The queen, however, had high expectations, believing that Alan would surely help resolve the issue. Seeing this, Alan decided to act tough, so he shouted at the old wizard, calling him a sick, filthy piece of trash. But the wizard told Alan that he got the situation all wrong. He explained that he wouldn't dare violate the spirit girl. Alan then warned him to stop chasing the girl around because his Rizless gene was only scaring her. At that moment, the scared lowly hid behind the long ears of the queen. The old wizard, now on the ground, pointed out that he was indeed a gentleman and that all he wanted was to get to the village of the elves. Hearing this, Alan was stunned and thought this old man must be psychotic. So, he informed the clueless grandpa that they were already in the village of the elves. Hearing this made the old man excited, so he told Alan that he would love to see the Queen of Elves urgently because he needed to make an elixir. Alan then pointed the queen to the old wizard, and as the old man tried to move toward her, Alan dragged his old scrawny back. Alan explained to the man that his disgusting appearance frightened the elves because they assumed he was an evil spirit, so he would have to speak to him for the time being. With that, the old man told Alan that he needed to make an elixir, and all he wanted were petals from the spirit tree and honey from the elves. Alan asked if, by getting all this, he would definitely stop traumatizing the village with his horrible presence, to which the man agreed. With that, Alan turned, informing the queen all the man had requested. Immediately, the queen ordered her servants to bring what the man requested, which they did. Seeing the items, the man tasted the honey and commented that this was exactly what he had been looking for. So, he told Alan he was extremely grateful for his help and was indebted to him. After that, the old wizard left the village, never to return. With that, the queen thanked Alan, calling him a divine child favored by the god of wind. Even Princess Sherry was impressed, but chose to dish out Yandir vibes. However, the queen begged Alan to spend the night in the village. Later that night, while enjoying some alone time in the hot spring, Alan thought about the day's events and how he wasn't familiar with the scenario. Suddenly, he heard someone call his name. It turned out to be this amazingly ripped elf with massive flashbulbs who offered to play Diddy. So, Alan responded, telling him that by all means, he was free to oil up. The following day, the entire village was in a ruckus. Alan, confused, demanded to know what the issue was. The queen responded, informing him that the spirit of light had been born. She then showed him a girl playing with Loli and mentioned she was the spirit of light. She further elaborated that it had been 800 years since a spirit of light was born, which signified that a saint had been born in the human world. At that point, Alan recalled that he was familiar with the event surrounding the birth of the spirit of light. In the game, it took place just after Amy, the protagonist of the game, finished the event of saving the village from demons. Suddenly, Loli approached Alan, thanking him for saving her life earlier, and then handed him a scroll as a gift to show her gratitude, leaving Alan in shock. Alan used his appraisal skill, and according to the information he got, the scroll enabled the user to learn the skill Chantless. When it was time for Alan to leave the elven village, the queen thanked him for his help and gave him a special amulet imbued with the prayers of the elven villagers as a token of gratitude and friendship. With that, Alan entered his glider. He immediately activated vertical elevation, and the glider took off to the sky. Seeing this, Princess Sherry was highly impressed with the boy. However, before zooming off, Alan bid the elves goodbye, promising to return. Hours later, while lying on his bed at home, Alan analyzed the situation. The first phase of his plan was complete. He had gotten all the skills he needed, and the money for his tuition for high school was also covered, so bro was good. However, the second phase of his plan needed to commence immediately, to build up enough strength to win the duel with the prince. To do that, he would need Goku-level training. The following day at the guild, it was announced that Alan would embark on his first goblin-slaying mission. One guild member then advised him to stay alert, while a random drunkard begged him not to die. But Alan told the idiot he would surely be the first to enter hell with how much alcohol he consumed. On the other hand, Rudolph urged Alan not to throw his useless life away and leave his mother alone and sad. That moment, Monica appeared, grabbing Alan by his head, placed it roughly on her bouncy castle, and remarked that his mother wouldn't be the only sad one if he met his maker. She then gave him a resounding slap on his back, urging him to do his best to stay alive. Later that night, Alan told his mother about his first goblin extermination mission, so she gave him a nice embrace. This massive display of affection hardened Alan's resolve to alter the game scenario and save his mother at all costs. The next day, Alan sold some honey he had brought with him from the elven village to the old merchant, who bought it for 2 million cents. After the transaction, Alan asked if he had any magic bag the size of a room for sale. However, the merchant told him if there were anything like that, it would cost more than a Cybertruck. A magic bag was more like an item that could carry much more than its appearance suggested. Finally, the day for his goblin extermination mission came, so Alan headed to the village that needed the goblins, which disturbed the citizens, exterminated. On entering the village, Alan met the old village chief, who explained that they had been dealing with goblins' attacks for 6 months. After that, Alan sat inside his inn, contemplating the huge financial constraints the mission would have on his finances since annihilating goblins wasn't profitable. Also, the value of goblin stones was low, excluding that of the final boss. The next day, our boy headed to the outskirts of the village. wielding an AK-47 he had just smelted using alchemy. Using concealment, he hid in the bushes. Even though he desired to go to the labyrinth, where the number of goblins was higher, he knew it would be best to start from the forest. Suddenly, he sighted a goblin in the vicinity, so he squatted and aimed his AK-47 like the Marines. With precision, he took out the goblin, and when he got closer, he realized that his shot wasn't that great, but at least it impacted the chest. After that, he retrieved the goblin magic stone, which brought happiness to his face. Following that, our guy took out 2 other goblins, and after retrieving their stones, he incinerated their bodies in the smelting pit he had created to avoid the smell attracting demons. When he was younger, Alan used to be terrified of goblins, but now that he was older and with his perfectly crafted AK-47, he was better equipped to take on any damn goblin. At the end of the day, he sold the 12 goblin magic stones he had acquired to the village chief, and the old man paid into his guild account, which Alan confirmed. After hunting for a week, the number of goblins in the forest dwindled, so he decided that his next point of action would be to enter the labyrinth. Although the labyrinth was crawling with goblins and demons, in its depths lay the core, protected by the final boss. With that, Alan entered the labyrinth, holding a lamp he had purchased from the guild that lit up with mana. Entering deep into the labyrinth, he immediately noticed 2 goblins. Even though he was invisible to the goblins, they could see his mana-imbued lamp. That instant, Alan aimed his AK-47 and blasted those 2 ugly idiots to the ground better than John Wick. He also took out 2 more as extras. That moment, Alan could recall the labyrinth layout because he had cleared it many times when playing the game. He also remembered that this path had no treasure or reward, so he would have to hurry to the final boss. Finally, he got to the basement of the labyrinth, where the final boss stayed, protecting the core of the labyrinth. He inserted a fresh magazine into his AK-47, after which he pulled the charging handle, ready to take on what was ahead. According to the game, the final boss consisted of 2 hobgoblins and 2 goblin mages, followed by the helmet-wearing Goblin King Beast. On entering the basement, Alan first sent the goblin mages to meet their ancestors on time and then reloaded. Next, he took out the hobgoblins by the side of the Goblin King. With the lesser threats eliminated, he began firing at the Goblin King, but the bullets deflected. Just then, the Goblin King unleashed his Thor hammer, nearly turning our boy into a pancake, but Alan barely managed to escape. Alan quickly hid from the big dude, but at that moment, he knew he had to use his special countermeasure weapon. So, without wasting time, he tossed a sack of peppery water bombs at the Goblin King, which blinded him. In a bid to wipe off the pepper from his eyes, the Goblin King removed his helmet, exposing his bare head. With that, our boy saw his perfect chance and fired a clear shot to the Goblin King's forehead, eliminating him instantly. Afterwards, Alan retrieved the Goblin King's magic stone and then moved to where the labyrinth core was. According to the game's plot, the labyrinth would die if this core were destroyed. Instead, Alan touched the core because he recalled touching it would transport him to the dungeon's entrance and reset it. After this, Alan smiled because he had just conquered the dreaded Goblin Labyrinth. A few days later, Alan returned to the guild, and everyone was impressed with his achievements. Even Rudolph, who hardly praised anyone, commended Alan for eliminating 138 goblins. When Monica came, once again armed with her cannons to congratulate Alan, she was disappointed when she realized her toy had gone home. Walking home, his system updated, showing that he had successfully cleared the Goblin Labyrinth. With this accomplishment and the cash at his disposal, Alan knew it was time to move to the next operation. But first, there was something that needed to be done. The next day at the guild, Rudolph stared in disbelief when Alan and his mom, standing before him, mentioned that they wanted to find a new home. However, before this happened, Alan got home from executing the goblins. His mom, overjoyed that he was alive, rushed towards him, enveloping him in a warm embrace and then kissed him. While they had dinner that night, Alan informed his mom that he would be moving out of the crib since he was loaded now and, most importantly, the house was too small to contain his adventurous stuff. He said he would love for her to stay with him but wouldn't want to force her decision. Hearing this, his mom stared him in the eyes, called him an ignorant fool, and then remarked that all she wanted was for him to be happy, so anywhere he planned on staying, she would stay with him. So, back to the present, after informing Rudolph that they were moving into a new apartment, Alan's mother introduced herself to Rudolph as Katerina. With that, Rudolph saw this as the perfect opportunity to use his best Discord line, which clearly impressed her. After this, Rudolph informed them that he was just a worthless guild master who knew absolutely nothing about real estate and couldn't help them much. So Alan pointed out that since he was useless, he could as well introduce them to someone knowledgeable in the field. Just then, Monica, who overheard the whole conversation, appeared, asking if they were planning on moving out. Seeing her, Katerina thanked her for using her melons to inspire her son to achieve great things. Monica told her it was fine and suggested they come to live with her since they were searching for a new apartment. Upon hearing this, Alan and Katerina were in shock, wondering what the nutcase was yapping about. However, Monica clarified herself, pointing out that she ran a low-budget Airbnb with her dad so she could show them some of their nice apartments. However, the price started at 100,000 cents per month. The low price of the apartment surprised Alan because even a shabby apartment would cost about 60 to 70,000 cents. Monica then suggested they check out the apartments, but Katerina was in no hurry and preferred to greet the guild members. Shortly afterwards, the trio walked down to the apartment, and on reaching the high-rise building, Monica informed them that the only apartment available was on the 4th floor. As they climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, Monica also mentioned that her current room was on the 5th floor. Getting inside the room, Alan was shocked that the room was so spacious compared to the rat hole he used to live in with his mom. One of the perks of the room was that he could also see the castle clearly from his window. On the other hand, Katerina thanked Monica for giving them a luxury apartment at such a low price. But Monica told her not to worry because getting to clap the hell out of her son daily was a worthy investment. With that, Alan announced that they would take the apartment since his mom liked it, and the transaction concluded. A few hours passed, and we were back at the guild. Rudolph, relaxing in a chair, demanded to know how the house hunting went. Alan informed him they had decided to take Monica's offer to stay in her apartment. Hearing that was good enough for Rudolph, another guild member then asked when they would be moving into their new crib. Alan replied, telling him the plan was to move in gradually over time. However, the man was displeased and insisted they just move into the place already. At that moment, the nosy man began shouting, asking the rest of the guild to help Alan and his mom move. However, Alan declined, saying they didn't need to, but the dude silenced his useless mouth, insisting he accepted the help they were rendering. Just then, Monica jumped in, advising Alan to accept the help of the men. On the other hand, Katerina was both surprised and thankful that her son had such lovely guild members, while Alan almost teared up, realizing he was this loved by the guild. Shortly afterwards, the men started moving their belongings into the new crib, and when they were done, they realized the house was still very much spacious, like it was empty. After the hard work, a guild member suggested celebrating Alan's new shank. So, holding a cup of booze, Katerina thanked the adventurers for their help and for caring for her son. Most importantly, she thanked Monica for ensuring her son didn't die a worthless virgin, and then wished all the adventurers luck and happiness in their endeavors. At that moment, Alan thought about how to make life comfortable for his mom and save the adventurers who had put a smile on her face. Just then, one adventurer grabbed Alan by the neck, commenting that his mom had a massive giant. The rest of the cultured men joined in, saying they wished to have a one-night stand with her. Suddenly, Rudolph silenced their disgusting mouths, which made Alan sigh in relief that at least one person still had a functioning brain. But then, Rudolph completed his sentence, informing the men that he would be the first to have that special plot-filled moment with Katerina. Without wasting any second, Rudolph showed he was a talk-and-do type of guy by approaching Katerina and trying to woo her. However, this move only angered Alan, who immediately changed his mind about the number of people he would save. The men who wanted to clap his mother at all costs wouldn't be part of his list. Before long, Alan entered the forest to test out his AK-47. Just then, he considered making another gun with a smaller caliber that used full metal jackets. So, with that, he smelted a smaller caliber version of the AK-47 that used full metal jacket bullets. The following week, Alan entered the dungeon again, fully aware that the dungeon was a great place to earn money and level up. After circling the goblin dungeon for a week, Alan was able to amass a lot of magic stones, which he sold at the guild. However, the guild merchant wondered if Alan had some kind of beef with the goblins to wipe them out in such large numbers. After the sale, Alan checked his window status and then realized he had earned the nickname Goblin Slayer. The scene then shifted to a massive, ugly orc that was shot down by Alan while holding a gun in an orc forest. This was a hunting request Alan took from a town nearby. The orcs in the forest were spawning from the great labyrinth of the orcs deep in the forest. So, after eliminating the orcs in the forest, the next target would be the labyrinth. Crouching on the ground in the forest, Alan thought about the best possible way to eliminate the orcs since they were tough and had very high HP. Later that evening, Alan visited the best restaurant in the town and had a taste of braised salted orc shank served with potatoes, which he absolutely enjoyed. He had never expected orc meat to taste so good and wished his mom could have a taste as well. The next day, he headed for the Great Labyrinth of the Orcs. Like the Goblin Labyrinth, the most effective method was to swiftly head to the boss floor, while taking down the small fries using concealment. The final boss of the labyrinth was the Orc King, surrounded by a few mid-bosses. On getting to the final boss, Alan obliterated the Orc Mage and Priest with a single strike and retreated using a smokescreen and concealment. Suddenly, he noticed a mighty energy blast from the Orc General, which he narrowly evaded. He was stunned because he never thought the Orc General possessed such mighty power. However, he continued attacking the two Orc Generals who were protecting the Orc King with smokescreens. As usual, he thought of using the chili pepper water bomb he had used on the Goblin King. However, when he blasted them with the pepper water bomb, it did not affect the Orc King, whose eyes just healed at a very fast rate. At that moment, the Orc King began to charge towards Alan at full force. Alan fired directly at it, but this did not stop the charging orc, who crashed into the wall very close to Alan, almost sending him to the great beyond. Just then, Alan recalled that the orc's hard body hair and thick subcutaneous fat would make it impossible for hollow point bullets to penetrate. So, he decided to make use of his AK-47, which caused greater damage than his other rifle. With that, he aimed at the heart of the Orc King. However, he suddenly realized that the ferocious Orc King was charging towards him for the second time. Nevertheless, he managed to take a shot at it, but as the Orc King crashed into the wall, Alan maneuvered his way out of the impending danger. Getting up, Alan immediately thought about smelting a shotgun using slug bullets since all his weapons had been useless against this beast. But in that instant, he noticed something shocking. The Orc King was sprawled on the ground and didn't make a move. Alan then assumed the beast must have passed out from smashing its head against the wall. As he got closer, he realized that the Orc King was dead, and this was due to the bullet that had penetrated its heart. With that, Alan decided to take its magic stone and some of its delicious meat home. Just then, he remembered a treasure chest at the labyrinth's exit. When he had used appraisal earlier, he discovered that inside the chest was the bracelet of fertility, which granted women equipped with it the power of reproduction. And so, Alan conquered the Great Labyrinth of the Orcs. In the next scene, Alan arrived at the Elven Village. He had been visiting the elf village regularly to buy honey, and the people had been welcoming. He had also converted the kids' playground to his personal hangar, which everyone, except Sherry, was cool with. This time, Alan had turned 13 and accumulated orc hunting achievements, becoming a rank D adventurer. Just then, the Elf Queen, dressed in nice, thirsty clothing, approached Alan, informing him that the honey he requested had been piled up in his glider. She added that he could also devour her honey pot before leaving if he wanted more. However, Alan hurriedly declined and told her he wasn't interested in playing cougar. Disappointed, the Elf Queen mentioned that she heard he was going on another adventure. Alan replied, telling her it was time he took on the difficult labyrinth. The next labyrinth our boy would be heading was the Labyrinth of the Wind Mountain. This labyrinth had a vicious blizzard phoenix as the final boss, which only a formidable fighter could take on. Hearing this, the Elf Queen was worried about his safety, but Alan assured her he still wore the amulet she had given him. She smiled, telling him that the amulet would protect him and then wished him all the best. So, the next day, our boy arrived at the City of Wind Adventurers Guild. The receptionist asked if he planned to solo the Wind Mountain Labyrinth alone, to which Alan replied yes. The scar-faced receptionist glanced at his stats, realizing that the boy was just a child and wondered if this level of recklessness was due to youthful exuberance. Anyway, he cleared Alan, permitting him to enter the labyrinth. However, he warned Alan not to play the protagonist of the game and to just stick to exploring the first level of the dungeon. Alan thanked the man and then headed to the Labyrinth of the Wind Mountain. This labyrinth had 30 levels, but so far, the greatest adventurers have explored only 8 levels. However, our boy intended to conquer every level and keep circling it until he entered the academy. Just then, he noticed 2 vampire bats and was stunned at the level of dark aura they emitted. But then, he wasn't scared because the odds of conquering the dungeon were in his favor. His confidence stemmed from the fact that he had smelted the perfect Russian shotgun, which he named Sega, that could take down any beast. Thanks to the power of the Sega, Alan blasted his way through the dungeon, easily breaking the standing record of skilled adventurers and reaching the highest level ever recorded, level 28. At that moment, he was faced with floating islets. To get through, he had to target the small orb on top of the islets with his wind magic, and then he would automatically teleport to the next islet. However, this had to be done in the correct order. If done wrong, he would be sent back to the labyrinth's entrance, meaning everything he had done till then would be a total waste. On top of that, he had to battle the vampire bats as he navigated his way through the islets. On reaching the last islet, Alan took a little detour to the side. Using his smelting ability, he crafted boulders that he used for descending. With that, he found the substitute ring, which granted the wearer the power to revive when they die. According to the game's story, Amy, the heroine, found and collected the rings, but our boy gratefully took them this time. Now that he had insurance, Alan got to the gate of the final boss of the labyrinth. On entering, he faced the vicious Blizzard Phoenix, which didn't waste a second attacking him with sharp blizzards and feathers. Alan immediately shielded himself with the PC shield he had smelted because he knew the scenario too well and was prepared for this exact attack. After enduring the first attack, Alan activated concealment and fired his shotgun at the bird. However, the bullet only grazed its feather, and the bird screeched angrily. The vicious bird attacked again that instant, firing blizzards and ice arrows at Alan, which he deflected using his shield. But the ice almost froze him to death. So, he immediately smelted a boulder and retreated behind it to rest until he could get a clear headshot. Noticing a clear opportunity, Alan exposed himself, activating concealment. However, he soon realized he had miscalculated and emerged too soon as the bird was still on its rampage. So he quickly hid behind the boulder again to wait for the attack to stop. Shortly after, he devised the strategy of randomly attacking and hiding behind his smelted boulders. After several fierce attacks, Alan suddenly noticed the bird soaring high and descending headfirst at an incredible speed. This was the perfect opportunity he had been hoping for. Courageously, Alan charged towards it, only to suddenly slip on the frozen ground. He started to glide uncontrollably towards the fallen bird, but somehow managed to regain his balance in time. Approaching the bird, he realized the phoenix was far gone into the afterlife. Relieved, he pulled out its melted feather, quickly removed its magic stones, and collected its bones. Opening the treasure chest nearby, Alan found the Sword of the Sky Knight, which can only be used by someone who possessed the Knight Divine Protection. Although our boy had no use for the sword yet, he found it rare and valuable. Just then, he noticed the highlight of the dungeon, the Magic Stone Synthesizer. This equipment increased the size of normal small magic stones by 10. The bigger the size of a magic stone, the greater its market value. With that, Alan took the magic synthesizer and circled the dungeon for a while to earn more money and experience. Days later, at the guild, Rudolph, obviously surprised, asked Alan why he was still taking ditch cleaning requests. Alan responded, telling him he only did that in his spare time. This time, our boy had turned 14 and would finally start attending school. With that, Rudolph advised him to complete the rank-up predetermined request and increase to a C-rank adventurer as fast as he could. This would prevent the nobles at the school from bullying him. Alan replied, telling him he really didn't care about rank. However, Rudolph felt the kid was hiding something from him because, come on, everyone cared about rank. However, he advised Alan to take advantage of the opportunity. The real reason was that Alan didn't want anyone to find out about his skills just yet, as it could affect the entire game scenario. Suddenly, 3 guild men who looked wasted stumbled in, cheerfully remarking how much they looked forward to working with Alan. But Alan didn't have the slightest idea of what the old drunken fools were talking about. Rudolph then clarified, revealing that, as guild master, he had assigned Alan to join the trio on a mission the following morning and emphasized that he shouldn't be late. Hearing this, Alan was both shocked and annoyed, protesting to Rudolph that he'd rather team up with a donkey than these creeps. At that moment, one of the men leaned in uncomfortably close, questioning why Alan didn't want to join them. Overwhelmed by the biochemical weapon emanating from the dude's face hole, Alan recoiled in horror and loudly complained to Rudolph that the guy smelled like a distillery. How will this mission affect the game scenario? Will Alan be able to save everyone in the game? Comment Villager A if you're eager to find out in our part 2. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. As always, thanks for watching.